Hey everyone, Soundly here with Mick West. Mick is the author of Debunking the Rabbit Hole, which many of you have heard me reference many times. And I want you guys to take a look at that book as well. Mick, thanks for joining.
I'm glad to be here.
So, Mick, I've read your book a few times, and to be honest, I have too many notes. So I don't know how long or how long you have to stay with us, but
better than having too few notes.
Yes, hopefully we can get this done in an hour. But if not, I'm okay with extending it as long as you are. But I do want to say I grabbed my coffee and put an extra shot of DHMO in it, and took my homeopathic chemtrail pills, and I read your book, which I think you've referred to as your brainwashing manual for government shills at one point. I thought it was really good, and I really want to know, what motivated you to write a book like this?
Well, I've been doing debunking online for a long, long time now. I talk about in the book how I actually did it back in the late 80s, essentially early 90s, back on dial-up bulletin boards. I would talk to people on dial-up bulletin boards about things. And I've been doing it ever since. And 10 years ago, I started the whole contrail science thing, which is a blog I started to try to explain what the chemtrail theory was all about. And I thought I'd just explain all the science behind contrails, hence contrail science. And that was like 10 years ago. And then I got into the Metabunk, which, is a whole bunch more debunking things, a whole bunch of different topics like 9/11, flat earth, false flags, all kinds of things, forest fires now. And yeah, I've always wanted to write a book. And the way it came about was, I got out on the Joe Rogan podcast.
Right.
I'd done some work with Joe Rogan on chemtrails before for his TV show. And I was on the Joe Rogan podcast a couple of times, and someone at the book publisher saw my episode on Joe Rogan, and he liked it and thought it would make a good book. And so he asked me, and so that gave me enough push to actually do it after talking about it and thinking about it.
You're actually motivated because you felt like you could make something of it.
Yeah. Actually, got an opportunity to do it rather than doing it and having to sell it.
Exactly.
It was someone was
they
there.
Were coming to you, which makes it a little bit easier, right?
Yeah, a bit easier. Although it was still pretty hard. Writing a book is never easy, especially if you don't know how it's going to turn out and everything. My first book.
I think it actually turned out really well. There's a lot of resources in it. That's the thing that I find fascinating. Is I even used your the blog article that you have, where you have pictures of chemtrails or contrails from historical sources, and I really love that blog article because that's one of the first things you can go to. It's like, when did this start? When do you think chemtrails started? And they give you a date, and then you just go to your blog article and say, well, here's pictures from, what was the one, Ben-Hur or whatever, the Ben-Hur,
the Spartacus
cover, Spartacus, Spartacus.
Yeah.
So stuff like that, it's very useful, and I really appreciate that you have that resource out there. Please don't ever take it down.
No, I won't. Well, I think it's very important to have resources like that. And I think a lot of the time, people who do debunking type things like on Facebook and whatnot, they'll find photos like that, and then they'll post them on Facebook, or they'll show them to somebody. And then that work they've done is just kind of lost forever, because, if you post something on Facebook, you're never going to find it again.
Yeah, I totally agree with that.
Lost in the mess of Facebook. So if you can organize the stuff and put it into one easily findable resource and give it a nice title so Google will find it, then it's a lot more valuable.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, especially because Facebook, Twitter, those types of channels are usually, you're communicating with one or two people. I mean, really, in those threads, and there's no real easy way to say, go look at this whole thread.
Yeah, and the whole thing with the comments getting folded over, and you just can't find anything.
Exactly, you can't find anything.
It's a conversation. It's not, you're not really creating anything for longevity there.
Right. Let's take a step back. So we know we know about Metabunk, and we're going to get there eventually, obviously. But tell me about the younger Mick West. You come from a programming background, obviously. You go into great details, or you provide some details in the book about it, which is awesome. I really like that chapter where you just tell about who you are. But tell me about Neversoft, because I as a gamer / programmer, am very interested in your Neversoft experience, because obviously that's any developer's dream, is to do exactly what you did, which is to start a company and create a hit game and do what you want to do with programming, which is great.
Yeah, it worked for me. It basically, Neversoft started about a year after I moved to the States. I was working in the video game industry in the UK. I worked at Ocean, and had done a few games there, and got a job offer in the States for being paid twice as much, and it's in sunny California, and I had a bunch of friends there already, so it was kind of like a no-brainer.
Right.
So I moved over. The company that I got the job at, it was okay, but it wasn't the best of companies, and it wasn't really going anywhere in terms of my career. And then one of the guys there, who was actually the accountant of that company, I think, because he was the accountant, he'd seen all the figures and he knew how much money was coming in, and he thought, hey, I got to get me a piece of this. And so he looked around to see who was available to start a company, and he saw me and one other guy, Chris Ward, and we started Neversoft. And the first game we did was a game called Skeleton Warriors, which was this little side-scrolling game based on these toys and a Saturday morning cartoon back then. And
what year was this, Mick?
Oh yeah, God, I can't remember now. It would have been late 90s, 97. No, it would have been 95. Look at it on Wikipedia.
Yeah. So you're talking about competing with the likes of Quake at this point.
Well, not exactly, because obviously once you get into the games industry, you're not competing with them. That's what you want to be.
Yeah.
So yes, it was in that era. Like when at Neversoft, one of the big problems we had at Neversoft was that we played Network Doom all the time. So we got all the computers and we strung them together.
Sounds like a productive business day right there.
Yeah. So we could probably have got the company going a bit better a bit sooner, but we did eventually do all right. But it was touch and go, I think, because back then the industry was very kind of Wild West. People that just gone out to America or gone into the industry from doing games in their bedroom, and no one really knew what they were doing, and it was mostly young guys in the industry back then, and so they were just messing around. I was just messing around. I was like 20 something, like late 20s. And so we didn't really know what we were doing. So the company nearly folded a couple of times. We had like game canceled, not because of our fault. It was just like, things were changing in the industry. But, then we started running out of money and we had to find another game to do. And so we were going around all these companies trying to sell our technology to them. And we just managed to get one contract just before we were about to run out of money and had to let everybody go, and it was like a miracle. But and we was all steady improvement since then.
I think the way you said it, or you referenced it in your book, was you were at the right place at the right time, huh?
Yeah, definitely. I was lucky to, I think, be someone who was really interested in programming video games at a time when there weren't very many people doing it, and at a time when the industry was really taking off. So there was a lot of growth in the industry and an increasingly large amount of money in the industry. And I was also lucky that we were in the right place to do Tony Hawk, because that's the big moneymaker for us was Tony Hawk. We got the license to do it just after doing another game called Apocalypse, which was just again a fairly straightforward game, just a shooter. And we didn't really know if this skateboarding game would do very well at all. So we just tried to do the best game that we could. We did a game that we thought would be fun. Fun game that
it was
I
unique
enjoyed
for
playing.
sure, right?
Yeah.
At that time, there wasn't really any like X games out there.
There were a few kind of games like that. There was there was some like kind of snowboarding games,
Hmm.
which weren't really the same type of thing. But I think it was we had kind of a combination of like an open world kind of like in Super Mario 64 type thing, which
Yeah.
was kind of coming into being the default type of thing for a video game, in that you weren't just constrained to doing one thing, then another thing, then another thing. You get to kind of go around and choose the things that you want to do. And we also really got into doing the skate culture. We every lunchtime we would watch skateboarding videos of people doing like tricks in parking lots and things like that.
Right.
So we really tried to infuse the game with as much real skate culture as possible, and it had a good soundtrack as well.
So did you guys actually get to interact with Tony on a regular basis and ask him like what are the names of these tricks and stuff like that? Or
Yeah, no, he came in several times, talked to us, and towards the end of the game, we sent him builds of the game like every week, and he would play the game and give us feedback.
nice.
And he would even invite his friends around to play the game.
So he pretty much beta tested it for you, huh?
Yeah, essentially, yeah. And
That's
he
awesome.
he enjoyed playing it, and so it worked out really well because he liked it. He was getting lots of money from it as well because his name was on the game.
Of course, yeah.
But he enjoyed the game, and he helped make it a better game.
Well, that's the best part of it. If he enjoyed the game, then you did something right.
Yeah.
You have that genuine feel for skaters because he's actually enjoying it and giving you feedback saying, yeah, this is actually called this, not that, or something like that. I can imagine those stories.
Yeah, and that was very important, getting things right. I actually have here, I have the 2 fingerboards that I used while making the game, and it was very difficult to remember which way on a skateboard. It is a little skateboard. Which way was front side, which is back side, and then what's the difference between switch and regular and goofy, and skating switch and skating forward. And so I would use the 2 fingerboards, and I was thinking, if I'm coming up to a rail, do this. This is the right side, and then I'd write that down in the code, figure out exactly what was what.
Yeah,
it was a fun process.
I can imagine. That sounds fun. Did you guys write your own physics engine for that?
Yeah, the first, all of the games used like in-house physics that we did. The first game was fairly simple in terms of physics. Essentially, I think we used the previous game's physics as a base, which is just running around and jumping. So it's just simple moving under gravity. And then we just added skating, and then we just got to add a few more things to that, like traveling along a rail and doing the jumps off the half pipes and quarter pipes.
So was there general collision detection in that, or was it like hardwired for certain shapes?
It was general. There was like a polygon mesh that was matched the environment. You get the visual environment, and then you get a polygon mesh which matches that, which is simpler than the actual visual mesh. And so the skater would just basically travel along the actual surface of the polygon collision mesh.
That's really awesome. That sounds like a very interesting project to work on. I would have loved to do that. I can tell you that right now.
Yeah, it was actually fun. Because I like playing it as well, and I did.
Yeah, of course.
The controls was like what I was mostly focused on. Yeah, I kind of started out doing it as a producer at the start of the project, and then I moved more into actually being the actual programmer when we lost one programmer. And so like everything to do with like what your thumbs do and when you press buttons, that's mostly what I was focusing on, and the physics of how the skater moves through the air and how they turn around and then land back down in the half pipe, which is something you don't think about. But when you actually go up these half pipes, the code turns you around nicely just so you land down exactly the way you came. It just feels really nice. And that type of thing, the feel of the game, was what I was really focusing on.
Well, that's very interesting to me. I think that a lot of other people would find that very interesting as well. So I appreciate you sharing that. This reminds me a lot of Richard Garriott, which I mentioned to you earlier. Richard Garriott has a gaming background. He still does gaming, as a matter of fact. And he, of course, was one of the first paid space tourists, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And this brings up a point that I also have a software engineering background. There's a lot of engineers that are in the debunking world. And why do you think that is? Why do you think we're, one, drawn to debunking, and two, why do you think we're prone to doing it with that background? Do you think it's something related to our background?
Yeah, I think the experience you gain when you're writing code, and especially when you're debugging code, when you're trying to figure out why something doesn't work, is kind of similar to what you do when you're debugging, debunking a conspiracy theory. You're trying to figure out what's wrong here. Now, say someone shows you something like, there's a mountain in the distance, and the curvature is such, and so you shouldn't be able to see that mountain. You want to figure out exactly what's going on. And because you're a computer programmer, you do it in a fairly unemotional way. You don't get emotionally invested in what the outcome is, and you don't prefer one outcome over the other. You're just going for what is the actual root cause of what's going on. Do when you start out programming, you tend to kind of go down like little blind alleys when you're looking for things, and you get things stuck in your head that it's a certain way. And over time, you learn that you've got to just basically let all your assumptions go and actually consider that everything you're thinking about this problem might be wrong, and you should just start from the beginning and try to figure out what the root cause is without any of your assumptions. So you learn to be kind of a very neutral thinker, which eventually makes you come to the correct answer, which is great for debugging, and it's also good for debunking, because you don't you will actually figure things out, and you won't just be trying to advocate for one side or another.
Yeah, and you avoid the pitfalls of blind assumptions, essentially.
Yeah.
This actually brings me back to your book. Right at the very beginning of your book, you talk about Willie, and specifically the ballast, the ballast in the planes, and how that became like a key for him. Well, actually, it was the initial thing that made him go down the chemtrails rabbit hole. But also it became this thing where he realized, based on learning what those were, that the whole chemtrails thing didn't make sense. So my question for you is, was there a point in time where you didn't know what those were, and then eventually learned what these were, and then were able to use that?
It would have been a matter of minutes, basically, because I would have seen the photograph, and then I would have looked at what it was, because it's not really hard to do. And a lot of the time the answer is right there, because there'll be some conversation. I think back then I was spending a lot of time, like Willie, on Above Top Secret, which is a discussion forum that's kind of conspiracy oriented. And there were people on there who would give you the answer. If someone posted a picture like that, someone else would very quickly post the actual correct answer. A lot of times you see that now with other things, like someone will post a link to some weird picture of a UFO or something, and if you just go to it and you look in the comments below it, you'll half the time at least you find someone has already figured it out. So most of the times it doesn't take much effort to figure things out if you actually go beyond just looking at the image itself, and you actually do a little bit of research.
Well, go ahead.
No, it's like when I first saw it, I would be like, "What is that? What are those barrels?" And I would have no idea. What it could be, like fuel. It could have even been water for cloud seeding or something like that. There are actually planes that have large containers of them, which are used for cloud seeding. So I didn't know what it was, but once I found out what it was, I don't remember how I did. It was it's pretty obvious and straightforward and interesting. It's an interesting thing, the fact that they have these barrels to simulate passengers, and then they pump water between these barrels to simulate the passengers moving around or being in different configurations. And they can probably simulate everybody rushing over to the right side of the plane if the pilot said, there's a shark on the right side of the plane. So they can, they can do all these tests. So it's it's an interesting thing.
It is a very interesting thing. That's what I've learned a lot about in this. I've learned a lot about astronomy in this whole flat Earth debate. And that's one of the things I can say is the silver lining about these debunking sessions is that you do learn things from people that do know things. And that to me is what draws me, it's one of the things that draws me back each and every day. This actually leads to another part, though. You did mention that you would have learned in minutes what it was because of these type of forums. However, Willie, it took Willie 9 years. So what is the difference there? Why is it that some people will seek out the correct information and accept it, and other people will take 9 years to finally, like, because I'm sure he saw that information at some point.
Right. Well, because he was just thinking of looking for information that supports his theory, essentially, or information about his theory. So he's heard that there are chemtrails. He looks around for information, and he sees this picture of barrels on a plane, and all he does is he connects the barrels on a plane to the chemtrails. So it's only going in one direction. He's saying, well, you know, the only reason there could be these barrels of chemicals on the plane is if they're spraying chemicals out of a plane, therefore it must be chemtrails. And he's not going back in the other direction and seeing, you know, what evidence is there is on the other side, you know, what actually leads up to the barrels, what's the explanation for the barrels. He's saying, he's seeing that the barrels support the theory of chemtrails. So you've got barrels, you've got chemtrails. Right. You don't have, you know, something else like flight testing and barrels.
Right.
So it's you find one thing like a piece of evidence like that, then you move on. Like in, say, 9/11, you see puffs of smoke coming out of the World Trade Center as the building collapses. And you think, oh, those are explosions. So that's evidence for controlled demolition. You don't go back and you think, you know, is there another explanation for this? You're just collecting evidence. And you're getting more and more, and so you get one thing, you stick it in the box, then you move on, you get something else. You see, oh, it fell down in 10 seconds, and you know, free fall would be a little bit less than that, so it's moving really fast. So free fall proves controlled demolition, and you know, you think of it as, you know, another piece of evidence for the free fall. You know, what's his name? Larry Silverstein said, "Let's pull it." And pull it as a term in demolition, therefore that's a piece of evidence. So they're just collecting these pieces of evidence, but they're not going and trying to figure out an alternative explanation, because there's no real benefit for that, because all they're trying to do is try to figure out, you know, what is the evidence for whatever the theory is.
So this kind of brings up like a need for a formal reasoning, or like a type of reasoning that has rules. That are not related to your emotional desires or outcomes that you want, your preconceived outcomes.
Yeah.
So that's one thing that I've brought up before. And what I've noticed is if you start bringing this up, inevitably what happens is you start talking about the scientific method. And there are, you know, I wouldn't say everyone, but a lot of flat earthers, a lot of chemtrail proponents, they almost look at science as the enemy, and like these types of formal reasoning are actually something to be avoided. How do we bridge that gap? Because obviously that type of reasoning will help them out of the rabbit hole, but if they actually look at it as a form of manipulation,
yeah,
you know,
I think
how do we bridge that gap?
You can't do it directly. I don't think you can go in and start telling people like your thinking is wrong. You know, you need to use more logic, or you need to use a more rational method. Because if you start telling people that, then it's essentially the same as calling them crazy or stupid. And even if they are crazy or stupid, you know, that's not a helpful way of moving them forward. I think you have to do it by example. You have to do it essentially by showing them things, and you can kind of move into this, getting them to think in better ways by showing them essentially mistakes that they made or things that they have missed. You know, if someone hasn't tried to figure out the reason for a particular piece of evidence and they just use that piece of evidence, then you don't want to start off saying like, oh, you're just ignoring, you know, you're not thinking about what the actual reason is. You should start off just by showing them what the actual reason is. Like with the ballast barrels, you show them the old articles about how Boeing used these in the 1950s and how they've been used in every single plane ever since. You show them this missing information, and they'll realize that they've made a mistake. They'll realize that they've missed something. Now they might just completely dismiss that and then just not do anything. But you have at the very least shown them one thing where they were wrong, You don't need to gloat over it. You don't need to like push the point. You don't need to say like, your thinking was wrong here.
Yeah,
What
this
you're
is the
trying to do is kind of nudge them towards realizing that they're doing something wrong, and it takes a long time.
yeah. This is the classical planting the seeds and letting those seeds grow, essentially.
Yeah, and watering the seeds regularly as well.
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
and putting in some more seeds when the first seeds don't seem to be taking, and then just keep doing it until something actually does grow. And then when it starts to grow, you've got to nurture it and prune it and give it TLC and maybe plant something else as well. It's not something where you can just say, "Oh, you should use more logic," and
Yeah.
then they're going to start using more logic. No, it's a lot harder than that.
I agree with you that that approach does. I mean, it will work in the long run, and I do also have to say it's very hard, and it's a very hard thing to do and execute,
Yeah.
and you kind of have to dedicate some time to it.
Yeah, and that's kind
and
of
to
like
individuals,
the book is focused on people helping their friends,
right?
and friends, loved ones, family, and it's not so much about arguing with people on the internet. If you're talking to someone on the internet that you don't know, you're probably not going to change their mind. You might plant a seed, but
Hmm.
you're not going to talk to them for years on a regular basis,
Right,
or for months on a
and
regular
certainly not
basis.
over
Where
Thanksgiving dinner.
yeah, and if you've got a family member though, if you're married to somebody, or if you've got a parent or a sibling or a workmate that you see all the time, you can do this much more gradual approach,
Right.
which is what I talk about in the book. And you can do it online as well, but you're not don't expect instant results,
Yeah.
because it is a gradual process.
Yes, I have learned through experience not to expect instant results. That's for sure.
Yeah, often you get quite the opposite when you
For sure.
contradict someone. They get angry at you, and
And then they
they
start throwing around the
turn
shield
further
card.
away. Yeah, they pull out the shield card and wave it
Yes.
at you. So
Um,
yeah, you have to be slow but steady wins the race. Yeah.
so this actually leads me to another question that I have. So you're obviously your book is
Hmm.
obviously written speaking about genuine believers. We're talking about people that have a genuine belief, and they also are somewhat honest as far as a human
Yeah.
goes,
Yeah.
right? Um, but what about the people that, I mean, obviously there are people that aren't your friend, and the internet is full of them, where it's very hard to differentiate sometimes, but there are some people along the way where you go, okay, this guy is intentionally lying to people. Do you still try and treat that person as your friend, or do you kind of have that recognition that this person needs to be avoided, or do you confront
Right.
those people? Like how do you go about that?
Well, most of the time when I am dealing with someone like that, someone who is a promoter of a conspiracy theory, like, for example, Dane Wigington with the chemtrails, or Richard Gage with 9/11, or Jeranism, or someone like that with flat
Right.
Earth. Uh, they they're useful mostly in terms of illustrating the problems of the theory for other people. The people who are promoting conspiracy theories to such a degree aren't really interested in having a conversation with you. And if they do have a conversation with you, they're essentially acting as an advocate. They're acting as a lawyer for one side in a court case. They're not really interested in the facts of the matter or investigating things or figuring things out. They're interested in promoting a certain point of view. And maybe they believe in it, maybe they don't believe in it, maybe they're lying. But either way, you're not going to get very far. But by having a discussion with them in which you can point out things that they've got demonstrably wrong, then that can be very useful in illustrating for other people the fact that the people who are promoting the theory have made these mistakes and they're not backing down from their mistakes. So I talk about it in the book. Yeah, I discuss like pointing out where the sources of a conspiracy
Right.
theory got things wrong is a very valuable way of making progress. Like with, say, Dane Wigington, he's always going on about how high bypass jet engines can't make contrails, which is something that's demonstrably false and doesn't really make any sense. So if you can focus on something like that and show them, you think Geoengineering Watch, which is Dane's site, you think Geoengineering Watch is a really good resource, and yet it's got this information on it about high bypass jet engines, which is completely wrong, and here's all the reasons why it's wrong. So maybe some of the other stuff on that website is wrong as well. So yeah, I don't generally spend much time talking with them because they're not interested in talking to me usually. But they're very, very useful in clarifying the errors in the theory because they are so, they keep trying to push this false information.
They're adamant, yeah.
Yeah.
So let me ask you about that. I mean, there's proponent for a conspiracy theory, but there's also, I'd say, antagonist for individuals. So there's actually an antagonist that I've been seeing lately online for you. And I was wondering, like, why, when people specifically go after you, almost as a character attack, how do you approach that? Do you just ignore it, or?
I usually just ignore it. You're probably talking about Dr. John.
Yes, I didn't want to mention his name, but yes, that's exactly what I'm talking about.
He did some very interesting experiments where he was making observations across a bay. And seeing how high he could see some traffic lights. But then I tried to point out some things with his observations and the role of refraction, and he started making all these videos, like attacking me and calling me a liar and stuff. This coincided with me taking a 2-week vacation, and during that time I completely forgot about him. And whilst I forgot about him, he continued making more videos about me. And when I came back, I found all these videos. But he kept asking me questions which I just didn't think were particularly good questions. I think he didn't really understand things, but he had a very high opinion of himself. But anyway, I basically just ignore people if they start attacking me, and if they start getting threatening or anything like that, I'll just block them. And I haven't really had any major problems. People feed off your response. So if someone attacks you and you respond to them, that's just going to make them attack you more. It doesn't really matter what you say to them. You could try to be nice to them. You could attack back, or you could threaten them with legal action or whatever. But the best thing generally, I think, is just to ignore people who aren't really interested in a constructive conversation. So that's what I did with Dr. John. I answered his questions. He said, "Where's the source code for your what was it, the refraction simulator?" And I said, "Well, you just have to click on View Source on the web page, and it shows you the source code." And that's pretty much the last interaction I had with him.
Right.
So.
I find that interesting. I try to do the same thing these days. I used to respond back to the objections, and these days, and I've realized that it's just profited me zero to do such a thing. But one thing I have noticed, and it's really hard to overcome this hurdle, is that in my observation specifically, the flat earth shepherds, as I like to call them, will say they're fraud. They're not real. They're CGI, whatever. They just come up with reasons why they're not genuine observations. And it's really hard to overcome that hurdle with, I guess, the other people that we're actually trying to help. So what do you suggest? Do you have advice for me in that case?
Well, if they're saying everything is fake, I think it is a good approach to actually try to show that it's not fake. One of the things I do with the flat Earth stuff is try to demonstrate that satellite images are actually real, which I do by taking photographs of clouds from the ground and then matching them up with the clouds in the satellite images. So you can actually do things like that. You don't have to. You could make the argument that everything is fake because we can't go up into space and look at the satellites. So to a certain degree, you have to take it on faith that the satellites are actually there. But then again, you don't, because you can actually check these things. The International Space Station, people say that's fake, but you can actually observe it flying overhead. It always flies overhead exactly where NASA says it's going to fly overhead. And you can triangulate it by viewing it from two places, say 100 miles apart. and it gives you the exact altitude of being 250 miles up, and you can take photos of it with your P900, and it comes out as the exact angular size as the actual space station. So you know there is something that's following this spherical orbit, and
Based on the
is the
specifications.
right size,
Yeah.
and it is the right altitude. And you can even, if you want to go far enough, you could say, the angle of the solar arrays in your photograph with your P900 matches the live stream from the International Space Station. So you've got something where it does actually match reality. It does actually match what NASA is claiming is happening, and you can actually observe it yourself and test it. And there's no other plausible explanation other than it's real.
Right. Well, that's it's interesting that you brought that particular example up, because I'm going to put a link right here once this live stream is over for other people and whoever's watching it afterwards, to Reg Rhetoric and Astronomy Live's video where they did such a thing. They actually did triangulate the distance to the ISS. Very interesting. And I'll probably put another link up here as well to Wolfie 6020's video where he actually photographed geosynchronous satellites recently.
Yeah.
So there are ways that you can, in fact, confirm that there are satellites there. And there are also ways that you can confirm that my observations are real. And that's simply by going there and taking the photographs, which we will be doing in January, by the way, next weekend. So this kind of leads me into, the Mick West conspiracy spectrum, as I've been calling it.
Right.
And
that's what
I found it interesting. I found it interesting that you rated yourself a 1.5 on the spectrum. I think that at some point I was probably, a 2 or 3. And the more that I've started debunking, the more I've gone further over to the left. So I would say I'm probably even a 1 now, maybe even less than a 1. And I'm curious, how do you rate yourself as a 1.5? What things do you think might have some credibility to them on your own spectrum?
It's a pretty rough scale. So it's more to give you a general idea that, there is this scale where on one side there's, things that are real, and the other side there's things that are fake, and somewhere there's a line between real and fake, real and imaginary. And I gave myself a 1.5 because I am somewhat suspicious of people in government. I do think there is a lot of corruption, both in government and in industry. And I think there's a lot of shenanigans, for want of a better word, that go on around the decisions to go to war in various countries. And there's lots of issues in this country where things are done for individual profit over the good of the people, like the prison industry, for example. They're trying to reform the sentencing laws right now, but they're getting a lot of pushback from the prison lobby. The prison lobby is basically about making lots of money by incarcerating large numbers of people. So there's this essentially a conspiracy to make it seem like there's loads of crime, when really crime's at an all-time low. Crime's, been on the decline since I think 1990. So there are real conspiracies in the world, and they lead to real problems. There's big pharma. I don't think they're hiding a cure for cancer, but there was people in the pharmaceutical industry who are responsible for the opioid epidemic right now, which is killing tens of thousands of people every year. It's like the leading cause of death in young people now. And people were conspiring within that industry to distribute those drugs, Oxycontin,
right?
Oxycontin, and so there are very real conspiracies. So I didn't want to put myself all the way down to a 0 or a 1,
right,
and say there are no conspiracies, because there obviously are, and we don't know the extent of all those conspiracies. So I go 1 and then plus like a little bit for all the stuff that I don't actually know what is going on.
Well, I'm actually happy to hear you say that. I think that I think that's an honest approach, and I think that there are other people that will appreciate that aren't necessarily your fans right now.
Mhm.
And I do also have some beliefs that especially there are evil people, there are rich people, and there are evil
Right.
rich people that run corporations. We know that about the world, and they're going to try and take money from us in not necessarily the most ethical ways. So there's definitely conspiracies going on, and I think you mentioned that in your book. I don't think I know that you mentioned in your book that there are real conspiracies.
Yeah, I start the introduction of the book. The very first words are conspiracies are very real. That's the introduction of the book is about discussing the very real conspiracies that exist in the world. So, and the whole point of the book is to take people away from their focus on the false conspiracies so they can spend more time focusing on the real ones.
I really like that idea, and I think that's seeing the other side of Mick West, so to speak. I think is really healthy for everyone, and hopefully people can see the other side of me as well, because I do have a tendency to think that there are real conspiracies, and that we're wasting our time talking about all these non conspiracies. Really,
Totally.
and I wouldn't say we're wasting our time debunking them, but I think that.
No.
We're wasting our time having to debunk them because people are just involved in these other conspiracies that really have no consequence to their life, whereas the ones that do have a consequence to their life, they're ignoring because of these other conspiracy theories.
Yeah, well, people ask me like, well, why don't you focus on these real issues yourself? And I mean, I don't focus on these real issues because lots of other people are already focusing on them, and I think I can just do the most good and help the most people by focusing on these false conspiracies, because I can help hundreds, if not thousands, of people get out of the rabbit hole, and that's much better than me simply adding my voice to people asking for sentencing reform or whatever, where there's already tens of thousands of people doing that.
I really like those sentiments, because that's kind of how I feel as well. I mean, I don't really want to get into the politics, and I don't want to really get into big pharma, even though I have opinions and beliefs on it. But at the same time, I don't know enough, and I don't want to make the same mistakes that I see other people making, that I'm trying to actually influence myself by just believing in something without having enough information about it. So awesome. I really like your spectrum. And as a matter of fact, this might be a good time to share the Amazon link. I really, anybody that is my subscriber, I'm asking you specifically to go and look at this book, read a sample of it, Escaping the Rabbit Hole by Mick West. It's a really good book. I've read it twice, and I'm actually on my third read right now, and there's actually an audio book for it. And if you have Kindle and what's it, Audible, then you actually get a credit, or you get it half off or something in Audible, and you can actually sync them together. It's a really great feature. So I really like the book, and I highly suggest anybody go read it. And yeah, as far as the spectrum goes, do you mind if I show the spectrum?
No, go for it.
Yeah. So let me see if I can find it quickly. Where's the table of contents?
Yeah, it's in the
well.
Yeah, if you look at the table of contents, you'll see.
Anyway, I don't want to scroll through the whole book. I don't want to scroll through the whole book. But basically, there is a spectrum in the book, which I will try and get an exact link to, and perhaps link that as well.
There it is in the book itself, on my screen.
Okay, let me see.
Which is
perfect. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's like down here are the conspiracies, which are pretty boring. Things like big pharma lying about drugs and whatnot, and then over here we have like UFOs. And well, UFOs themselves aren't a conspiracy theory, but there are extreme conspiracy theories about them. And that's the thing, like these conspiracies, they can span like a wide range. There's like 9/11, for example, spans quite a wide range, because there are 9/11 theories, which are just things like the government let it happen. And then there are other much more extreme theories, which are things like there were nuclear bombs like buried underneath all 3 buildings that blew up and destroyed the buildings.
Or the most outlandish one that I've heard was that they were using energy weapons to take it out. And that's interesting that has now this mindset or this idea that the government has these high-powered energy weapons that can somehow vaporize an entire building are now being used in California to start fires. And that seems to be your most recent adventure. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, well, I live in California, and I live pretty close, in countrywide terms, to the Camp Fire. It's about 80 miles north of here. So, I got affected by the smoke from here, but also, like, talk to people around here, and they all know people from Paradise, which is the town that was wiped out. So, a bit of a personal interest just from living in the area. But people seem to have glommed onto this as being like the new thing. And the thing is, though, is not actually a particularly new conspiracy theory in its roots. What it's about is the Agenda 21 conspiracy theory, which is the idea that the United Nations, or basically the Illuminati, is trying to control the population by shepherding them all into the cities. And so they're doing things like burning down towns in order to make more people live in the cities. And it doesn't really make much sense when you look at what's actually happened, because most of the fires actually burn in uninhabited forests, which would be the things they would want to preserve under Agenda 21.
Right.
And there's very, very few, in real terms, very, very few structures actually destroyed, until Paradise. And where things have been destroyed, like, for example, in the Tubbs fire, there's a neighborhood called Kofi Park, which has been completely wiped out in a similar way to Paradise, and they're rebuilding. All the lots there are for sale. A lot in Kofi Park is going for, like, I think $180,000,
right,
which is probably more than a house costs in Paradise. But people are rebuilding in these areas where they were saying, the conspiracy theorists were saying, that they're trying to wipe people out and move them into the city.
So I have personal experience with this, not with the fire, but with a flood. My house was flooded in the August 2016 Louisiana floods. And the first thing I thought when they said, they're trying to vaporize these houses to push populations out, I'm like, you don't understand how it works. The insurance company's going to come in there and give them a check, and they're going to rebuild. Like, that's what's going to happen. I mean, I didn't leave because my house was flooded. I took a whole year to rebuild my house. And so It seems silly that we should even have to have these discussions, in my opinion.
Well, there's a nuanced version of the conspiracy theory which answers that. Every conspiracy theory evolves. Every time you come up with some kind of debunking, they'll change it. So now the theory is that the building codes have been changed to be much more strict now, and the insurance does not cover these new. It only covers the original building. It doesn't cover the new building that you'll need with the new building codes. So no one's going to be able to afford these rebuilding their house, which again doesn't make much sense. You can actually get insurance specifically for building code changes. It's actually a real thing that you can do if you want to.
Well, I can also address this as well. In the 2016 floods, essentially, if you didn't get enough money, there's like a whole nother program that comes around that says, okay, what did you have to pay out of pocket? And literally Louisiana and FEMA are both like making up the difference, which is it's a whole nother topic. I'm not necessarily sure that that's the right thing for the government to be doing, but they are doing that.
Right.
And so if they were intentionally trying to, push people out of these places, they wouldn't be doing these things. And
let's wait and see. Like 5 years time, Paradise is probably going to be rebuilding. There's people living there now, and they're going to start rebuilding the houses because it's a cheap, nice place to live. They'll just clear the brush a bit better this time.
I was surprised to hear you say that the lots are only $180,000 in California somewhere. That doesn't make sense to me. Well, it's so expensive out there.
It's in the suburbs of I can't remember where it was. Santa Rosa, not the most expensive area, but that's the thing. Like, they're thinking like they're trying to the theory is that the laser beams from planes or from satellites are trying to zap the edges of suburbia and push everybody back into living in apartments in San Francisco.
Yeah.
Which yeah, doesn't make any sense.
No, it doesn't.
People go for it. I
don't think those people would. If you're living in a mansion, which is basically what some of these houses were that were burnt down, you're not going to go move into a 2-bedroom apartment in San Francisco for the same note. Basically do anything. It just doesn't make any sense.
So the thing with these forest fire conspiracy theories, you've really got to try to figure out again what these people are missing. What information are they lacking? And a lot of them, they see the pictures of a house that's burnt down and it's in the middle of a forest and it's surrounded by trees. And it's quite understandable, I think, that people would be suspicious because they don't understand why that is possible. There's a lot of people, they think of a forest fire as being this just wall of flame that just consumes everything in its path. And you see videos of forest fires where you have that. You have these 80-foot trees and 150-foot high flames consuming them and leaping from tree to tree and just destroying everything in its path. But a lot of forest fires don't actually work like that. They work by high winds blowing embers ahead of the fire.
Of the line, yeah.
Yeah, and in California, especially in the suburban areas where things look very suspicious because you get like a house and then everything around it is perfect, people irrigate their lawns and their yards.
Right.
And so the trees get plenty of water, and so the trees that basically do not burn. It's almost like the fireproof trees.
The green wood, yeah.
Yeah, it's green wood. If you try to burn a limb of a tree that you chopped off, if it's not an old dying pine tree, then it's not going to burn. It's
just a reminder for me to link your video on this. Yeah, because you do have a video on this, and I'm going to link it so other people can look at it.
I was burning some brush yesterday, and I had some branches that were, I should have videoed it, but I had a live branch that I cut down 3 weeks ago, and I stuck it on the fire, and it started bubbling up at the end because it has so much moisture in it, and it didn't burn. Whereas everything else I threw on the fire, which had been lying around for 6 months since the summer, it just kind of went whoosh, up in flames. So
exactly,
dry wood burns and wet wood doesn't.
Exactly, and even pine needles. I mean, it's the difference between wet pine needles and dry pine needles. Sorry about that.
Yeah, green pine needles versus brown pine needles. Yeah, they just don't burn. And this is something that you can show people, you can demonstrate to people that these things don't burn. And I did that in my video. I burned a 2x4 and I burnt a live branch of wood, and one burned and one didn't. So this is things the way you can show people things, and hopefully they'll see that they missed something that they didn't understand. I did another thing like trying to explain why some trees appear to have burnt all the way down to the ground, leaving nothing but a hole in the ground. And what that was tree stumps that were like 10 years old, that were completely rotten and completely dry, like bone dry, because it had been a long summer.
I found it interesting that you actually went to Google Maps Street View and actually said, look, there's the stump that was burnt.
Yeah.
It seems like a thing that anyone could do. And this brings me back to the whole thought process. Like, why is it that there's this linear thinking, and how do we combat that? Because it's really hard to say, go look at Google Street View and them actually do it. That's the one of the difficulties I find often.
Yeah, I think you got to combine actually showing them these real explanations with encouraging them to do it themselves. You could say, have you checked this? Have you looked it up? Have you considered other explanations? Like on that tree stump video on YouTube, there were people in the comments giving the correct explanation. But because it's just something that's lost in the comments of YouTube, like not many people get to see it. So I did a different video explaining what was going on there. But yeah, you've got to, I think, in a way, you can kind of shame people into doing more work. And I have seen this happen a bit where I've shown people where they've been wrong enough times that they start trying to do a bit more work themselves and actually support their claims a little bit more. The more intellectually honest people will actually do that, given enough time.
one suggestion I have for you on your videos is a lot of times you have videos that are directly related to either a Metabunk article or a blog article, an older blog article on your contrails. What's it? Contrails.
Cultural science.
Yeah, contrail science. And I suggest pinning the top comment as a reference to one of those articles, because that's one thing that I think people do look at is pinned comments, because they will look at it. They will look at a pinned comment before they look at the description of the video for some reason. That's
true, because the description gets folded out, so you can't see it. And so, that's a good idea. And I have used a few pinned comments, and I think I'll do that a bit more now and pin a link to the actual thread.
I think it's a good idea, because I can tell you, I have links in my descriptions that are in every single one of my videos to this guy named Walter Bislin. He has a blog.
Yeah.
And people ask me to this day, who's Walter Bislin? Like, even people that are debunkers. And I'm like, man, I don't know what else to do. You know, I put it in every single one of my descriptions. But I have noticed that they will look at the pinned comments. So if I pin a comment to link to his blog, then people will actually go look at that.
Good idea.
So, man, it's already been an hour. I can't believe that. Yeah, so let me kind of skip ahead here, and let's. I could seriously do a 2-hour thing on this, but I'll try and keep it short. There was one other thing that you brought up in the book, and you were kind of describing the personality traits of conspiracists, as you like to call them.
Mm-hmm.
And interesting comment too, that you don't call them the paranoids, which is, I think, polite of you, Mick. I really appreciate it.
I don't think of them usually as really that much more paranoid than regular people. Like, I brought that up. So I don't call them paranoids because that used to be a term that people use.
Yeah, they actually use that
more commonly.
I do like the stats. I want to bring this up too, because you do have stats, or not necessarily stats, but I guess word usage that goes from newspaper articles and then eventually into Google Trends about the word conspiracy theorist.
Conspiracy theory,
yeah. And so I find that very interesting, because that's also the conspiracy is a very interesting topic about if the CIA invented that term or not. So I want people to kind of look at that, but I think that kind of all led up to people, were calling them paranoids, and eventually it became conspiracy theorists as more of a polite term. And
there's actually another term they use, which is devil theory.
Devil theory?
It went out of fashion. If you look up Barry Goldwater, when he was talking about running for president, they refer to him as a devil theorist, which isn't really about the devil. It's about blaming some conspiracy, essentially, so the reason he wouldn't have won the election,
the ominous
because of the a vast right wing or left wing or centrist conspiracy.
Right.
So I didn't know this actually at the time I wrote the book, that there was this other term, devil theorist.
So you brought up some personality traits, and whenever I was reading it, I was kind of going, I kind of think skeptics share that a little bit, the desire to feel unique, like a desire to feel like you are unique, the tendency to find patterns and things. I think that's almost a human trait.
Mm-hmm. They're all human traits.
Yeah, openness to new ideas
more than others.
Yeah, and so
people who have YouTube channels, they want to be seen on YouTube, and they enjoy people giving them views. And these are things that, regardless of whether you're a debunker or if you're a conspiracy theorist, that's part of why you do YouTube. We're not all doing it because they're just desperately trying to get the information out there. So these real traits that people have, and like you say, they are shared by debunkers too.
Yeah,
debunkers like to feel like they're the smartest guy in the room sometimes, and that's the feeling you get when
I witness that on a daily basis. I can say that.
Yeah, which is a problem. It is definitely a problem, because not all debunkers are that smart, and they often they wade in there and they start insulting people, and because they don't really understand the issues that well, it creates this impression that basically debunkers are just these loudmouth people. when we need to take a step back and have a more nuanced approach.
I said before we started this that I kind of feel like you might be where I am in a few years, like whenever I kind of mature a little bit more, maybe, because I do. You brought up the anecdote about Joe Rogan having this what NASA shield or something shirt like that.
T-shirt, yeah.
Yeah,
He wanted me
T-shirt.
to wear this T-shirt that said "Flat Earth Shill," and him and Jamie were wearing them. Jamie, the guy who runs the video.
Yeah. So
and
you declined that, right?
Yeah.
So I on the other hand, created my own. So it's like I kind of feel like nobody's actually getting paid to do this stuff, and I think most people know that. So I kind of feel like it's a way to diffuse the situation, and maybe you disagree with me, and I think we do disagree slightly on the approaches as far as the ones that I would call like obvious shepherds of a conspiracy. I might try and mock them a little bit, So my question to you is: were you ever in that? Did you ever feel the way that I feel? I guess
definitely. I look back on posts I made many years ago, and I think to myself, "What a dick." Because I was rude back then, and I was arrogant.
Yeah.
I'm not saying you are, but I was back then, and I think I've mellowed out a lot since then. Especially if I go back to the early days, like 20 years ago,
right?
When I was talking to people, it was like I knew everything, and they were stupid, and they should do more research. They should get an education. And these are all things that I tell people not to say now. I don't say don't tell people they need to get an education. Don't tell people they're stupid. Don't tell people their thinking process is wrong. Just try to talk to them, and because I found that works better.
Right.
And I talked about some experiences I had with my Morgellons watch forum. Morgellons is it's basically people have made a disease out of a whole bunch of symptoms, and plus the idea that fibers are coming out of your skin. So these are people who are very emotionally invested in the issue because it's about their health, and so they got very upset. And so I learned doing that you really have to have a very gentle approach to get through to people. And if you start doing anything that can be perceived as being insulting, then they will they'll switch off and they'll fight back. So it's not about what you mean. A lot of people says, well, I'm just joking, or I'm just I'm just pointing things out that are true. I'm not actually insulting this person because what I'm saying is true. But it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what your intentions are. If it comes across as being insulting, then it's
if
not
your goal is to insult people, then fine. But if your goal is to actually help people, it's not going to work very well.
Yeah, there was in the skeptics community, there's a guy called Phil Plait who runs the blog Bad Astronomy, which is now on Discovery, I think. And he gave a talk entitled "Don't Be a Dick," which was about this precise issue. It was about how being dickish and being angry is a negative thing. And I was kind of surprised that he actually got a lot of pushback from people in the skeptic community, people who were skeptics and debunkers. They thought that he was insulting them by telling them not to be a dick.
Yeah, I can see that.
They felt that I think I kind of understood it later in that they thought that their anger was genuine, and so people shouldn't tell them to suppress their anger. And this was more, I think, about less conspiracy issues. It's things like gender identity and things like that, where people have a much more personal stake. But it goes on to the conspiracy theory thing as well. Like, if you get personally insulted by someone, then why shouldn't you get angry at them and insult them back? It's like you're denying some kind of right. But again, like you said, it depends on what you're actually trying to do. What is your goal here?
Right.
Is your goal just to do whatever makes you personally feel better and do what you feel is right, and try to get some kind of justice for this insult, or is your goal actually to try to help people?
Right.
And I don't care about people insulting me. because they've been doing it for 20 years and it just doesn't matter anymore.
Yeah.
So I'm there trying to help people, so I'm just doing whatever works best.
I've definitely seen that in the last year. Like, okay, people are going to, call me liar or fraud, whatever. Okay. Who cares? It's like, there's nothing I can do about it. I just don't really care anymore. I've definitely reached that point.
Yeah.
So it has been a little over an hour, and I don't want to keep it. I don't want to make it too long. So I do want to go to the chat, which I have failed to do this entire video. I guess I've just been too engrossed in the conversation. And I feel like I've missed so much stuff. I mean, I have like 6 pages left, but we're just going to have to do it another time, I think. I do want to look through these comments real quick, and let's see if I sent you a link. Maybe somebody at mentioned you. I'm just looking for the at mentions for me. CrowX has a question for Mick about Gas Simulator, but he didn't actually leave a question. What is Gas Simulator?
That's a little JavaScript toy simulator I did, which simulates the atmosphere by simulating the movements of individual molecules. And it's used to explain why the atmosphere doesn't fly off into space.
Actually, I did see that. I didn't know it was called. I didn't know it had a name. I saw that video you did about, why, how can there be an atmosphere next to a vacuum?
Yeah, which is a good question. If you ask people that, I asked Joe Rogan that, and he didn't know. I mean, no one really knows. I think 99.99% of people ask them that question, they'll have no idea because they think gases under pressure should fly up into space. Yeah. Why doesn't it?
That's what I would categorize as one of the reasonable questions that can be asked.
Yeah,
and it is a physics question that needs explaining.
They are the educational questions, and things like this. I think they should teach this stuff in school.
They should. I totally agree with that.
Observational things as to why we know the Earth is flat and why the Earth is round. See, there I go again. Things that kids can do. You can go out and make observations of Catalina Island, or do what you do in Louisiana. I can make observations across Lake Pontchartrain. You can actually do these things and demonstrate that the Earth is round. You can do the angle of Polaris and the Southern Cross, and seeing that the South Celestial Pole is there. These are all things that people can do, and they're great. They're fun, like science experiments. Right now I've been doing more fire-based science experiments, which are also fun, but they're not really appropriate for school children. So these ones, which are more kind of like observational and geometry-based things, I think would be very valuable for kids.
Awesome. Let's see. Okay, one more question. There's 2 questions, actually. One is, well, I think we addressed Nathan's question. CrowX is asking if you can tweak your gas simulator to simulate stars forming.
Yeah, you can actually. Problem with that is that it takes a long time for a star to form. And if you can actually set it up in a way that looks like the universe. You have to turn on, what's it called now? Particle gravity, I think. And the problem with that is that since every particle affects every other particle, it slows things down a lot. So it's very, very difficult to actually get a real-time simulation of a large number of particles. So yeah, it's kind of fun though. You can actually set up what looks like, it looks like a rectangle. But when you start it running, after a while, it kind of resembles like the cosmic background radiation. You get these kind of patterns that look a bit like neurons and things, because the particles kind of clump together. And the problem is
forming like galaxies or something like that?
Yeah. The problem is that the actual universe formed in a big bang. So everything started in the middle and expanded outwards.
Right.
If you start everything just flat, everything just collapses in. So what you get, you get these local stars, but everything is going towards the middle. So you would have to simultaneously have a kind of a big bang and things coalescing within that big bang. which would mean the entire thing would be expanding and it would be very difficult to actually see it. So I mean, kind of the short answer is you can simulate one star forming because everything will collapse into one thing, and you get this big mess of stuff.
Interesting. Well, Mick, do you have anything for me, or anything else you want to talk about specifically? Anything you want to promote?
Yeah, well, I think like one thing that I would like to talk about very briefly is that people who have these concerns about conspiracy theories, often what their concern has some kind of underlying validity. Like people who are concerned about chemtrails, there are actually real issues around things like contrails. Contrails are a form of visual pollution, and they do actually have a small effect on the climate. So there are real issues that people have behind these conspiracy theories. People are worried about big pharma. Obviously, we talked about there are issues with corruption in corporations. People are worried about 9/11 type conspiracy theories, or even false flag conspiracy theories. There are actually real issues of corruption and spin within the government at various levels. So I think when you're talking to people, it's very important to try to acknowledge what the real issues are, and not simply just focus on saying you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong. You can actually tell them that there are things, they're not necessarily right in the sense that the Earth is flat or that chemtrails exist, but they're right in the sense that planes do contribute to pollution. Contrails do block out the sky. The government does lie about things in order to go to war with other countries. The petroleum industry does have a disproportionate influence on the government. There's things that are actually real issues. Right. So don't be too negative when you come to dealing with people. You want to help them, so you don't want to just take things away from them. You want to give them things and validate their genuine concerns.
I appreciate those sentiments. It's interesting that you brought that up specifically about chemtrails, because there was a particular forum that I've been a part of recently. It's a voice forum. We pretty much talk to each other. And we were talking about chemtrails at some point, and I was, providing the evidence that I've actually found in your book, because I really didn't know a lot about chemtrails until I started actually looking at your references in your book, which you have plenty. Great. And so I was talking to this person about that, and I noticed over the course of 2 or 3 days, all of a sudden we were talking about whether or not contrails were blocking out the sun and whether they were polluting the air. And I'm like, well, this is a completely different discussion. This is not where we started. And I kind of felt like I should just stop talking at that point, because I felt like we had actually made progress.
Yeah. So you can shift. It's like you're shifting people down the spectrum.
Right.
Yeah. The more you shift, the more they're getting close to the real issues. I think if you can move someone from controlled demolition 9/11 to the government let it happen 9/11 conspiracy theories, that's a good thing, because they're closer to reality, even though they're not probably not exactly without conspiracy thinking. But yeah, shifting people down the spectrum is a good goal.
I really appreciate you coming on. There's only one more thing that I have on my plate, and that is the 2008 NIST report about Building 7. Because I've noticed that when it comes to 9/11, Building 7 is like the key thing that keeps most people in there, because they're like, how did this building fall at free fall?
It's complicated.
What is the official story about how that actually worked, and why the conspiracy is in fact just a conspiracy theory, and there are more mundane answers to that building?
Building 7. Actually, I have a small model of Building 7 on my desk here. I built it a while ago, along with one of the towers. It's just a paper cutout. But basically, if you watch the video of the collapse of Building 7, you see a couple of things. You see the penthouse, which is this little structure. Well, it's little here, but it's a large structure. This is looking from the north here. There's this penthouse. You'll see this penthouse collapse, and you can actually see it fall all the way down through the building. You see this kind of wave through the building. So we know from this observation that a column on this side has collapsed and fallen through the building. So we know we lost interior support. And then a few seconds later, we see structures on the top start to collapse, and then the whole building gives way. So we've got these observations from the outside, which are kind of very limited. We know we could see that there were some fires down here somewhere, and there's other fires around the side. And from photos of the south side, we can see there's a lot of damage, lots of broken windows, lots of smoke coming out. There's what looks like one whole exterior column has been removed. There's a big gouge being taken out down here. So we have limited external information. And NIST basically has the same information that we have. They had to take these observations and try to figure out what happened. So you can figure out fairly easily that some columns collapsed here underneath this structure here. And we know that there was 3 columns here, numbers 79, 80, and 81. And so you can look at that and you can ask, what would make these columns collapse? And we know the fires didn't burn hot enough to actually cause the columns to collapse because the columns were pretty thick and they still had their fire insulation on because they weren't hit by planes, unlike the World Trade Center towers. So what would actually cause a column within this building to collapse? And it turns out what would cause it to collapse is if the floors that were adjacent to the building, to the column, were to fall, which would remove the support from the side of the columns. These floors like support column. If you remove enough floors from a column, it becomes what we call a slender column, which is very unstable, and it will actually bend under load. So you can figure out that probably what happened was some floors around here were damaged by the fire. They fell. Eventually, enough floors fell that it started a little cascade of floors falling, and that left this column 79 unsupported. It buckled. Columns 80 and 81 followed. And then it just kind of led to a cascade of things where inside other columns were failing. And then at some point, there was not enough support for the whole structure. So the whole building kind of crumpled at the base like this. And then it kind of folded and then went down like someone stomped on a big soda can. This is very difficult to explain to people. I showed it with this little paper model. And it looks completely ridiculous. But the physics of a larger model are completely different. Not a larger model, the actual full-scale building are completely different. There's a thing called the square cube law, which affects how strong something is versus how much it weighs. So if this was actually a scale model of the World Trade Center, for it to be the same effective weight as the World Trade Center model, it would have to be incredibly dense. It would have to be denser than pure gold. It's actually impossible to make an actual physically accurate model this side. Even if it was 6 foot high, it would have to be essentially solid gold to get the right weight to strength ratio. So it's very, very difficult to explain these things to people. And that's the reason why people go to this Building 7 is that because it's so hard to explain, it's very easy to dismiss NIST's explanation. Mm-hmm. People also glom onto the fact that NIST proposed one particular connection failure for Building 7. They said that there was one particular column, one particular girder that was pushed off a seat inside the building, and that was the thing that initiated the collapse. But if you look at their actual simulations, they had all kinds of different failures all around the building, and any one of those different failures could have been the one that actually started the collapse and had the floor strip away. So this has a reasonable explanation. You can nitpick like individual details on it, which is what people do. But really, it's actually the best explanation. They haven't really given a very good explanation for how it was done with explosives, for example.
Right.
How was it done silently with explosives? Because if you've ever listened to an actual demolition, they're incredibly bam, 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 bam. Whereas this was it just fell. The penthouse fell, the columns collapsed, and then the building collapsed.
I actually draw a little bit of a correlation between the thinking process of like the flat Earth stuff and geometry and the size and scales of the universe, and specifically Earth and the Moon and the Sun. And the size and scale of the job that it would take to actually put explosives throughout all these buildings. Like it just doesn't. It makes no rational sense to say that there have been crews of people coming in and just doing all the work that a demolition team has to do. And I think if you ask actually demolition experts like how much work it would cost, how much work it would take, like how much effort it would take to actually take down a building like this, that the numbers that they would throw at you would be ridiculous. How do you secretly do something like that?
Well, one of the early theories that was promoted on the websites that kind of were precursors to Architects and Engineers to 9/11 Truth, which I talk about in the book, I think, is the ceiling tile theory, where they actually seriously suggested that what happened was all of the ceiling tiles were replaced with explosive ceiling tiles in the World Trade Center towers. And they did the math, and they said there was about 2 million ceiling tiles. And so they had a crew of people going in, swapping out every single ceiling tile in every single office throughout the entire building, and somehow connecting them up to some kind of detonators, and then having them go off, boom, 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 all the way down. And that's how the World Trade Center demolition worked. The early theories were pretty ridiculous. The whole thermite thing came about because they were trying to figure out why, when the tower fell, it kind of left the core of the tower, like half of the core of the tower was still standing. And they couldn't understand why this would be, because, if you're demolishing a building, that's the first thing that you should get rid of. But they came up with this strange theory with thermite, which was that they used thermite to destroy the rest of the building, and all the molten iron fell down to the bottom of the building and pooled in this 2-foot deep bathtub of molten iron, and then that melted the bottom of the core, and then the core came down. And this is the actual root explanation of why they talk about nanothermite now.
Wow. You're talking about...
I think it's very important to understand the history of these conspiracy theories. A lot of people, they think that the theory as it is has always been the same theory.
Right. But it has evolved to this.
Yeah, they think with chemtrails that it's always been about geoengineering, but it wasn't. I mean, it was originally about the New World Order poisoning people with additives to military jet fuel, to JP-8. And the 9/11 conspiracy theories have been all over the map, and they haven't, kind of narrowed down into the specific version that they are now. But it's still the same people who are promoting these older theories who are now promoting these new theories.
Yeah, there's definitely an evolution. I think as there are objections that are raised that can't be answered by them, the actual theory itself evolves into something that's immune to that objection. Yeah. And I've noticed that as well. Yeah.
Then they get stuck. It's like evolution comes up with things like the appendix, which it doesn't serve any use and it causes lots of problems. And so you ask, if that's obviously there was no intelligent design behind that. But in conspiracy theories, they have things like thermite, and they decided that it must have been thermite that caused these demolitions, and so they go looking for evidence of thermite, and they anything they can find that vaguely points towards thermite. They say, that's evidence of thermite. It's like we were talking about earlier. You find something like ballast barrels, and you think that's evidence, but they don't look to see why are these ballast barrels. With thermite, they find these iron microspheres, and they say, iron microspheres are something that you find when thermite is burnt, so that's evidence of thermite. But they don't step back and think, what other explanations are there for iron microspheres? And it turns out there's a whole bunch of explanations for iron microspheres, like from welding and grinding and all kinds of things. On the paint chips that they found some red and gray chips, which they said were active, unreactive thermitic material, just because it fits in with their case. It's like they're a lawyer trying to argue a case.
Right.
They don't really care so much about what's the actual reason for these paint chips or these iron microspheres. They're thinking, how can we use this thing that we found to support our case. They're only trying to present the facts in a way that supports the case. It's like if you're at a trial and you only listen to one side of the argument, you're going to believe that side of the argument. They are the lawyers presenting one side of the argument, and their followers are only listening to them. They're not listening to the other side of the argument.
That's a very good way of putting it. Do you think
outside of that, there's actual objective reality, which is what I try to present? I'm not trying to be an advocate for one side. I'm not trying to be the oppositional voice to these conspiracy theories. I'm trying to say what actually happened. Now, you get people who I think do actually try to just argue one way or the other, like the defense attorney, prosecution attorneys. But you want to get away from the adversarial courtroom discussion and try to get down into actually finding some common ground and figuring out what actually happened.
Do you think that is a clear evidence of the dishonesty, or do you think they actually believe what they're arguing for? I mean, well, I guess it depends on which personality you're talking about, but it seems like a lot of them actively avoid truth in such a way that it seems like they know what they're saying is wrong.
I think, if you look at, say, people like the NRA have a vested interest in promoting guns, so they won't necessarily be entirely honest with everything that they do. I'm not saying that's a conspiracy. That's just because they're an advocacy organization. So they hire the chief guy, Wayne LaPierre, I think his name is, and his job is to promote gun ownership and Second Amendment rights. And with 9/11, you've got Richard Gage, who's the head of architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth, which is an organization that spends like upwards of $700,000 a year on promoting the 9/11 conspiracy theory. Richard Gage draws a salary. He gets paid like $80,000 a year, plus all of his travel expenses and hotel rooms. Wow. So he's very much got his mandate. What he is being paid to do isn't to neutrally investigate 9/11. It's to promote one particular version of the 9/11 conspiracy theory. So I think you really have to keep that in mind when you listen to what he is saying. Is he saying this because he honestly believes it, or is he saying it because it's the position of his organization in the same way that Wayne LaPierre is promoting guns?
I find that particular aspect of it interesting because it's I would say that there are very similar things with Flat Earth, obviously, where there are people who I believe are profiting from telling a lie, and at some point they may have genuinely believed it, but I think they've said enough things enough times, and even you brought up Jeranism earlier. Globebusters had a ring laser gyro where they actually measured the rotation of the Earth, and there's actually a very good documentary that just came out maybe a month ago now called Beyond the Curve. And Jeranism himself basically describes this experiment where he says if this outcome happens, it's a globe. If this outcome happens, it's flat.
Right.
And the whole documentary ends with him going, "Hey, okay, move your flashlight." And moves his flashlight, and it's like the globe outcome.
Yeah, I saw that.
Yeah, that's interesting. but to give you some context, though, that's a year old now. Like that documentary was about 2017, and so he's still doing his thing. So I have to believe that he's not being honest anymore. Because I think he's actually proven to himself that it is a globe. And
well,
how to combat that is just a big question mark in my head. Like
I think, well, if say you did an experiment, you went out to Lake Pontchartrain or something, and you said like, I'm going to do this observation, and it turned out that your calculations were wrong, and your results kind of showed that the Earth was flat. I think you personally would assume that you'd made a mistake.
Yeah.
Because you have a strong, very well-founded belief that the Earth is round. So for Jeranism to go out there and find something that's completely contrary to what he expected, I don't think it's unreasonable for him to be like, oh, there must be something else going on here. from his point of view, it's possible that he's thinking that
he's made a calculation error as well.
Yeah, there's some mistake.
The methodology's bad.
Yeah, you can go back and you can say, "Oh, I didn't account for the fact that light goes like this," or whatever the explanation is he comes up with. Or I did it at 6 o'clock, and at 6 o'clock there's lots of birds in the air, and that bends the light in a certain way, or some explanation. You can always come up with an explanation, but
well, surprisingly, you've given me a reason to give him the benefit of the doubt. So, you've actually changed my position on this in just the last 30 seconds.
My work here is done.
Yes, exactly. Well, Mick, I really appreciate you coming. This has gone on an hour and a half, and I could sit here and talk to you all day, but I'm not going to keep you all day. I really appreciate it, and we'll have to do it again because there's a lot more to talk about.
Yeah, sounds good.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks everybody for coming. And I'll try and add those links. I'll try and remember to add those links once this is done processing. And appreciate it. Thanks, Mick.
See ya.
Bye.